consequential vice presidential debates in our time. That is because, of course, President Donald Trump has contracted COVID-19. It's 27 days before the election, and Trump has COVID-19 after months of downplaying and misleading the public about its threat and possible cures. 210,000 people have died, 7 million have been infected. Trump just last night killed prospects of a new stimulus bill, and new data from the Census Bureau shows 1 in 3 Americans, or 78 million people in the last 7 days, have had difficulties covering expenses such as food, rent, mortgages. And so we have a lot to talk about tonight. We're joined live with 2 guests. And I just wanted to say, emphasize that we are live. So we want to hear your questions and comments so we can discuss them with our panel. We have Steve Horn, who is a Real News climate correspondent, and Maurice Mitchell with the Working Families Party. He's the national director there. They work to elect progressives and help pass progressive legislation across the country. So this debate was a different flavor than the presidential debate we sat through last week. Harris and Pence, went at it for 90 minutes. Let's start off by getting your Maurice with your initial thoughts on how this unfolded.
Sure. Well, I think number one of the things that rung so clearly to me, given the fact that Donald Trump currently is recovering from COVID-19, and last night he basically said that he wasn't willing to negotiate a COVID relief bill until after the election. What I heard again and again is Donald Trump, Michael Pence, and the Republican Party's complete abject failure to protect regular working people. Humorously, somebody said that the fly that landed on Michael Pence's head was ultimately the victor today. And what I think people were saying was the fact that no real news, I think, was made. I mean, but ultimately, the thing that I think is clear, and this is something that we said last time, is that our mass movements, folks who believe in a Green New Deal, folks who believe in transforming our economy and our democracy, absolutely, we need to sweep Trump into the dustbin of history. But then we're going to have our work cut out for us directly after Election Day, both to protect our democracy and then to advance our agenda. It couldn't be more clear based on what I heard on that debate stage.
And Steve, what were your big takeaways tonight?
Well, I think the way they conceptualized the debate, it's a little bit crass maybe, but this was the brains of the 2 operations, I will say. I mean, Trump probably doesn't always listen to Pence, but you can get a good idea of what Trump's agenda is, sort of spoken a little more eloquently. Obviously, there's a lot of spin in there, lies, gaslighting, etc., on a number of areas, on each of the number of times within each policy prong that was talked about. That said, I mean, I just want to respond a little bit to what Maurice said, which is on a lot of areas. I mean, I think that Kamala Harris and Biden have made clear they are kind of more interested in speaking to how many Republican voters that they have behind their backs. They're a little bit more interested in talking about people like John Kasich, talking about people like Colin Powell. Didn't hear much about the things that they're excited about that's progressive. There's a lot of things where they said we do not support things like we don't support a ban on fracking. We don't number of areas where they're, and it makes sense. That's the voting coalition that they have. And Kamala Harris, I think, speaks about it more eloquently than someone like Joe Biden, who, to be honest with you, is a little bit bumbling with his words. So, yeah, that's what I meant by we kind of could hear the clear vision from both of them a little bit better. And there's not the nonsense of Trump interrupting every 2 seconds. So, yeah, those are kind of the big picture things. Obviously, we can drill down on the issues, but the style of the debate was remarkably different. So it was at least easy to kind of understand and get a clear roadmap of, at least really clear roadmap of what the Biden policy vision looks like, which we didn't get last week, at least because of the bizarre nature of the debate.
Well, I would definitely agree that it was very different than the presidential debate, but we did see Mike Pence talk over the moderator, Susan Page, and talk over Kamala Harris constantly. And we saw him really not answering questions. So I'd like to go to a clip we have of Pence responding to a question about whether the Trump administration would accept the results of the election, something he didn't really answer. Can we go to that? So we're going to go to that in a second. But the bottom line is he did not answer that question, and he brought up false allegations of voter fraud, which we know do not exist. They've been debunked by nonpartisan experts, and they've been debunked by Trump's own FBI director. But we'll go to that when we can. But Maurice, let's get your response to that.
Yeah, the reason why he evaded that question, and I think this is critical to everybody who's watching, Donald Trump is not an aberration. Sometimes we talk about him as like a singular individual, sort of like running around the, almost like comically running around the White House, sort of incoherently, sort of babbling. But this particular commitment to suppressing the vote, and ultimately this question on whether or not the Republican Party is going to sort of support the peaceful transfer of power, that's an imperative and a strategic imperative of the infrastructure of the Republican Party, and would require the support of state Republican parties as well as the broader Republican apparatus and key figures in the federal bureaucracy. It's not a small thing to try to steal an election. So the fact that he evaded it suggests that there's no daylight between him and Donald Trump on this issue. And we should be clear, there's no daylight between Donald Trump and the Republican Party, which has been captured by the Trump movement on this issue. And the last thing I'll say is that Trump is just a symptom of at least 40 years of a concerted effort by the ultra wealthy and the various forces in order to capture the Republican Party and so that they could capture the federal government, and they've succeeded. So again, I just want folks to decenter Trump and his sort of clownish behavior and look at the structural imperatives of organized capital, the far right, white nationalist, and you saw that on stage today, which is why he wasn't able to answer that basic question.
Now, Maurice, were you satisfied by Kamala Harris's response to the question of election integrity? What I got away from her answer was that they're concerned and they want people to go out and vote. But do you think people have to be prepared to do more than just vote?
So that was one part of the answer. People should absolutely go out and vote, and we need people to go out and vote in record numbers, because a good defense is a great offense. If we blow out Donald Trump and his coalition with record numbers in a number of states, then it makes it much harder for them to attempt to steal the vote. However, we have to do a lot more. Everybody who's watching this and is interested in defeating the Trump agenda shouldn't just vote. We need to volunteer in order to be poll watchers and to be poll workers in places. As we know, senior citizens have taken those roles, and many seniors are going to stay home. We need to fill those gaps so that people could actually administer the elections in localities across the country. Post-election, if it's even a kernel of truth about Donald Trump attempting to steal the election, then we need people to be vigilant in order to make sure that every single vote is counted. And we know that election day will not be election day; it's going to be election season. We might not know the outcome of the election until absentee ballots and mail-in ballots are counted in the weeks and months afterwards. And so we're going to need a very dedicated, vigilant electorate that's doing more than voting. Us, the Working Families Party, and the Movement for Black Lives Electoral Justice Project, we recently came together to start a year-long campaign called the Frontline in order to bring regular people who want to do more than voting to the front lines of our democracy to do exactly what I talked about. And if folks are interested, they should get involved in the front line. They could text the word frontline to 30403 and immediately get plugged in with folks in their community that plan on defending the vote.
And Steve, I wanted to get your response to that question, and also, when Kamala Harris made the charge that Trump, defended white nationalists. Pence said, "Well, look, Trump has Jewish grandchildren." That was the essence of his answer there.
Well, yeah. I mean, that is, I think it's a common refrain, but of course, he still did do what he did. So I mean, you can say what you want about who's in his family, but the bottom line is he did call, kind of rally the troops around the what happened last week with the Proud Boys. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess plausible deniability on their part. It's a nice try, but it doesn't line up with reality in terms of the question about voting integrity, and voter fraud, and this whole thing, this whole narrative that the Trump administration has created. I mean, they've really created sort of every piece of the apparatus to try to bolster that particular agenda. And for example, it must have been minutes before the debate tonight. The Department of Justice, they are seeking ways to ease ease their way into doing what they consider investigations into voter fraud. So they're trying to create this kind of impetus to basically call out what they're going to try to call an election that is not valid. That speaks to the fact that I think they're very desperate right now. The polling numbers look pretty terrible for the Trump administration, in all honesty. I mean, if you look at the most recent swing state polling numbers, even the Florida polling numbers, which was supposed to be a closer swing state, it's not super close right now. And I'm not trying to be someone like in 2016 who's looking at the polls and saying, "Oh, it's a surefire win for Hillary." I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still a lot of crazy things that can happen, but the bottom line is that they've had a very bad last couple of weeks. Talking about the thing with COVID and Trump getting it, and just what happened at the debate. I mean, last week must have been one of the craziest weeks in the history of presidential campaigning, period. So that is sort of that is what they're dealing with, and they're trying to create some kind of narrative that will allow them to sow seeds of doubt in whatever the final result is of the election come in November.
So Pence is the head of Trump's coronavirus task force. He was asked about being exposed to the coronavirus at the White House, where they had a Rose Garden ceremony for Amy Coney Barrett, Trump's nominee to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg, on the Supreme Court. And then before the debate, Pence makes this big deal, almost pulls out of the debate about having dividers, the plexiglass dividers, which, the New York Times had a piece quoting scientists saying like that probably isn't going to be enough, even though they're 13 feet apart. Um, I want to ask you both this question. Do you think Kamala Harris was effective in really hammering the Trump administration's response? Because as we know, it's been totally disastrous, on just about every scale. But how Pence answered was blaming China for it and saying there would have been far more deaths if they hadn't stopped travel from China, which didn't I feel like it didn't leave a lot of people satisfied. Maurice, what were your thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, there's so much ground to cover when it comes to the complete. It's not. I wouldn't say incompetence because it's willful. Like I've actually used the word genocide to describe the scale of the wanton and organized government sort of management of the COVID crisis. There's so much to cover, and I do think that number one of the most important things for folks to to be able to leave with is the fact that this is deliberate, right? There were deliberate decisions made since early in this year that led to us being exposed, and to this day. And it has to do a lot with sort of Trump and his administration's sort of perspective on an ideological perspective, right? And their ideology, this commitment to unfettered capitalism at the expense of human life, actually, doesn't comport with what we're seeing. So if you remember, pretty early on in COVID-19, there were Republicans arguing that seniors should sacrifice themselves, sacrifice their lives in order to somehow prop up the economy. And what is the economy? The economy is people interacting and exchanging with one another. And there's no way you could have a robust economy if people are dying and people are getting sick. There's actually no way you could abstractly support the economy by quote unquote opening up when opening up leads to as much death that we've seen throughout the country and all the spikes throughout the country. And it's this type of really insane thinking that has led to all of these deaths. It's like in the face of just common sense and science, they're trotting through with their arch conservative sort of political line, and is causing hundreds of thousands of deaths.
Steve.
Well, I think that one of the interesting talking points, and I don't think we've really broken it down yet on the Real News Network. So just to highlight it a little bit, this is within right-wing media. There's a lot of talk about, and we heard it tonight, how in the Obama era there was swine flu, and they got, I guess the way it was framed tonight, and this is how it's always framed, is they just got lucky that it didn't get as bad, as opposed to maybe they were actually planning and listening to scientists and did what the scientists were saying. I'm not 100% sure if like the truth of one or the other. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle. But I have a hard time believing what Pence and what the right wing media is saying about it, that it was just roll the dice, lucky kind of thing, that swine flu didn't impact the United States more badly. I think that it probably had to do with a much more apt response to that. So I just wanted to point that part out, and then to talk about the response from Harris for a second. Yeah, I think it was a good blow by Harris in terms of the way that she framed it, and really Pence didn't have a great response to it, except for, I think their most effective response always will be that at first Democrats didn't want to be honest with people either, in that they did say the whole thing with China was xenophobic and closing down the borders, but in reality, and maybe in hindsight we know more, but that was probably maybe the one good thing the Trump administration did, is the one that they point out, as opposed to the 100 plus terrible things they did on the virus. And that just, I think that maybe that speaks to, at the moment, that people didn't know as much, Democrats maybe didn't know as much about the virus. But that said, I don't want to let the Democrats completely off the hook either. I mean, here in California, there's been plenty of bad decisions that have been made by Governor Newsom that have made the virus worse. There have been bad decisions made in Los Angeles, where today was a day with the highest total of COVID cases in 6 weeks. I mean, it's not like things have completely subsided here in California. So there's plenty of blame to go around, but obviously the leadership comes from the top in this country, and who has the most resources is the federal government, who really has the biggest bully pulpit still to speak honestly about science. Is still the president of the United States of America, and the vice president. And we haven't been getting that out of the Trump White House at all.
Now, I took issue with the debate moderator, Susan Page, on how she framed some of these questions. She asked Kamala Harris a question about the economic recovery. She mentioned economic devastation, but then she said, some economists think taxing the rich is going to hurt the recovery. Which we know that billionaires have made trillions of dollars of profit. They're Jeff Bezos could give every one of his employees like $100,000 and still be better off than he was before the pandemic. So, just the way they framed the questions, I think, was a little absurd, considering just the absolute devastation we've seen in the economy. And there was a movement to get the moderators to talk about the 1 in 3 people that have trouble paying their rent or behind on their mortgages. Maurice, would you have liked to have heard more about the real economic plans that could help people that are hurting right now?
Sure. I mean, and lines like that from sort of the less independent corporate media, some economists, exactly which economists are we talking about? Some is a very subjective number of anything, right? And sure, you'll always find an economist or an expert or a climate scientist that will agree with any point of view. And that really doesn't say very much. It's not a substantive, useful sort of comment. And for such a serious debate, you expect to have a contextualized question. But yeah, that was, I agree, very problematic framing. I mean, I would love to see more serious debate on the economy, right? And the sort of neoliberal consensus is more and more, becoming discredited, and including some of the, more centrist economists are openly arguing against some of the austerity politics of the past. So for us to be stuck in this sort of like antiquated debate around investment and austerity, when those policies and those politics and those economics have roundly been discredited. I think it's just kind of unfortunate. We should have a fact-based debate about the economy. Sure, if conservatives want to present their point of view, they have every right to do that. And if those of us that believe that investment in our people actually is a way to drive the economy, we could offer that. But I think when debate moderators are sort of like putting their hand on the scale and framing it as in the best way to sort of present neoliberalism, I think it's just unfortunate. It doesn't allow for that robust debate to happen. I think that was a missed opportunity.
And
Yeah.
Steve, I wanted to ask you because there was questions framed, I feel like, in a similar way, especially around climate. Again, we had the same conversation after the first debate last week, but what kind of questions would you have liked to like to have heard on this debate? And what would you respond to, specifically the questions about climate and increasing taxes to pay for things like the Green New Deal, which a huge percentage of the population, a majority of Americans, support something like that?
Yeah, well, I'm a broken record here, but it was the same exact mistake as last week, which is they framed the question as, "Do you believe in climate change?" Basically, do you believe it's a threat? When the overwhelming scientific consensus is that until I say overwhelming, I mean 99%, over 99% of climate science papers say that climate change is a threat to our planet and the civilization as we know it. And so it's not really a worthy question to ask them, do you believe in it? It's more worthy to say it is this, that is not being unobjective, if you will, to state the
Steve,
facts.
you said 99%. So what you're saying is there's a debate, right? That one.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's listen to that 1%.
Exactly. And I just want to, yeah. So it speaks. I think and this is the ritual of these debates every 4 years. Also, just one thing I want to point out because I didn't get to last time, but the beginning of the debate always starts with a perpetuation of a lie, and so it's not surprising that questions get misframed thereafter. So if you heard Susan Page at the beginning of the debate, she said, "This is presented by the Commission on Presidential Debates. It is a nonpartisan organization. This Commission on Presidential Debates is controlled by both parties. I mean, whether you support third parties or not, it's a convenient way where they've left other options off the stage in debates, so that and it's funded by big corporations, and that speaks to how and why every question is framed the way it is that it is the Commission on Presidential Debates is funded by corporations. These debates are brought to you by some of the biggest corporations in the world every 4 years. That's who puts the thing together. That's pretty well documented in the past, at least. I'm not sure if it's still funded by corporations, but at least past ones were. And that's who the CPD is. So it's not completely shocking that the questions are framed the way they are. And then B, it's not completely shocking that we get only extremely establishment reporters like Susan Page or last week Chris Wallace who see the world the way they are, because they're all, at the end of the day, they're all part of this same kind of bipartisan neoliberal establishment that puts this whole thing together. So I just really wanted to point that out, because you don't often hear even who the Commission on Presidential Debates are and what their history is or anything. But that's always the quote unquote big lie at the beginning of these debates, is how they speak about what the CPD is.
Now, I want to turn to a moment in the debate, one of several moments where in the climate change, specifically fracking, was raised, which is obviously it's been a contentious issue for years in communities across this country. Let's go to that clip.
Joe Biden will not raise taxes on anyone who makes less than $400,000 a year. He has been very clear about that. Joe Biden will not end fracking. He has been very clear about that.
So both of your thoughts. Joe Biden will not ban fracking, which, we know it's terrible for the environment. We know it raises CO2 emissions, and it poisons drinking water. It is harmful for all aspects of the environment, but it does provide jobs, which I think is what I guess the Democratic Party is trying to go for. Steve, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, that's them speaking to voters in Pennsylvania because it's a key swing state. That's them speaking to voters in Ohio because that's a key swing state. So that's just the easy political calculation, the calculus behind why they're saying what they are. I think step B is follow who the advisors are in the Biden camp. People like Ernest Moniz, funders who are involved in funding organizations like the League of Conservation Voters, Larry Linden, former Goldman Sachs executive, who helped push through a bill a couple weeks ago that gives $2.3 billion. This is the Democrats' climate bill in the House, gives $2.3 billion in subsidies for things like enhanced oil recovery, carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon capture utilization and sequestration. So, yeah, I mean, I'm laying this out because I know that there's some people in the climate movement who want to try to put a positive spin on what Biden and Harris are doing. I think we should be at least honest, upfront about what's going on here, and in the way that is exactly the roadmap, and that's what's going to exist. If or when they get elected at the beginning of November, that's where they stand. That's who they're. People like Ernest Moniz, who's a key climate advisor, the former Secretary of Energy of the United States under Obama. Those are the people that they're listening to right now in these policies. And I think the climate movement knows that, because they put out a call to action saying that they don't want anyone with any fossil fuel industry ties calling the shots, but people like it have been calling the shots, at least on the campaign trail. So, it remains to be seen, what kind of power they'll have to stop that after the election day if they win. But that is the paradigm that we're in right now, and I think that is exactly why they're speaking, pro fracking as opposed to speaking out against fracking, and saying that they, even saying we believe in science. At the same time, if they really believed in science, the climate science says on fracking that methane emissions are 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide in the first 20 years in the atmosphere. So if you believe in science, you believe in climate science, doesn't really, I don't think that you can also say that I support fracking out of the other end of your mouth. So but that's the dynamics at play here.
Yeah, and I would just add a few things. So this idea that you can't win in Pennsylvania if you have a strong environmental record. So WFP candidate Summer Lee ran in Pittsburgh and won, and she ran on a agenda that included banning fracking. Right? This is Pittsburgh, right? This isn't Williamsburg or the Bay Area. This is the industrial Midwest. So the idea that folks can't run on a very strong environmental record and even openly talk about what the science requires us to save our planet, I think just flies in the face of victories like Summer's. There's no way that Summer would have won in her community if folks weren't emboldened by somebody just speaking plainly and not being afraid of their own shadow. I think Democrats need to stop being afraid of the issues that will save our country and the world. Those issues will inspire tens of thousands, millions of people to vote, to organize. And the more they play these little these micro targeting of various little segments and slicing up the electorate and basically handcuffing themselves in order to appeal to one sliver of the electorate or to pander to another in order to bolster their vote totals. You create an incoherent line. So yes, I couldn't agree with you more. On one side, you say that you believe in the science. On the other side, you can't admit that the fossil fuel industry ultimately needs to be demobilized. And the other thing I thought about was, thank God for the sunrise movement. Thank God for all of the climate justice organizations around the country that are doing the organizing on the ground, so that after this election, we'll have a movement that will make sure that banning fracking, being able to demobilize the fossil fuel industry, having a just transition for all of the workers. So there's substantive conversations we need to have. Like, there are people who are working in the fossil fuel industry. Those people need to understand what's going to happen to them, what's going to happen to their communities, what's going to happen to their jobs. And we do need to invest in their communities and invest in a just transition so that they can transition from fossil fuel jobs into a regenerative economy. There's some real substantive issues that we could have gotten into, but it requires people being bold enough to actually say what's necessary.
And I just want to point out one quick thing about Pence, because we were talking a lot about the Biden team, but the line was used tonight, and it just because I've been involved in covering climate change for a long time, so I'm very familiar with the lingo. And the line by Pence used tonight was that probably not 100% true based on what we're talking about, but that they're extreme. They're kind of on the extreme end of the the left of the climate movement, is how he framed it. Then he says they are climate alarmists. And that is a line straight from the climate denier playbook. That is something that's been around for decades. That is how, the fossil fuel industry funded Republican Party has basically blocked any movement on any meaningful climate action for decades in this country. So just to be crystal clear, that is what Pence said tonight. And just to preview something I'm working on for the Real News, I mean, climate change within his own state, where Pence came from in Indiana, kind of not known as a state that really, not a climate state, if you will, maybe not even known as a state that could have massive climate impacts. I mean, it's right off of Lake Michigan, and that could have very big impacts on coastal erosion. It's right, the Indiana Dunes National Park is there, and it could just eviscerate this pristine national park. There's all kinds of impacts that I'm kind of documenting for article that should come out in the next couple of days in the Climate Crisis News Roundup. But even if someone like Pence just completely basically denied climate change tonight, even in his own home state where his brother is still a member of Congress in his old seat, Greg Pence, it can have enormous impacts in a state like Indiana, not normally thought of as this, not a coastal state, so maybe not thought of as a state where there's impacts in the same way where, California, there's fires, or down in the Gulf, there's hurricanes. But indeed, there could be future massive, huge climate impacts in Indiana and all across this country. So I just wanted to put that on the map as well.
Steve, I wanted to ask you, and Maurice too, the issue of the Green New Deal. It was raised several times in the debate. Pence attacked Harris for sponsoring it, for being one of the original co-sponsors, and saying, it would cost lots of money to get it implemented. And then what is so Steve, if you can answer this, what is the Biden-Harris position on the Green New Deal? We saw AOC tweet about how the Green New Deal has been lied about nonstop, yet it is still popular.
Well, yeah, I think it became clear last week, if people didn't know, they also don't support the Green New Deal. There are some people in the climate movement who think that some of the things, if you package them together and what the Biden-Harris climate plan is, that it kind of amounts to a Green New Deal and everything but name. I don't really agree with that, because one of the staples of their plan is what I just mentioned before, which is this carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And then there's all these other things around like geoengineering and stuff. So their plan is, I guess, reflected in some of the bigger green groups' plans. If you look into those, if you look at what groups like the League of Conservation Voters are pushing, the NRDC or the Sierra Club, I mean, they definitely support more green energy. They support more R&D going towards that, and definitely more subsidies and all of that. But at the same time, there's really no, it's just kind of the same as the Obama. Those who are watching remember the Obama era, without using the phrase, it's kind of the same thing, the quote unquote, all of the above energy strategy. And that's basically what they're pushing right now. And obviously that would not be what the Green New Deal is, which calls for a phase out in fossil fuels. Basically, to put a fine point on what their policy is, they say that through all these schemes, that by 2050 they can get to net zero carbon emissions, including, and that a huge part of that is things like I'll just explain what CCUS is for a second to be crystal clear about it. It's capturing carbon at power plants, it's pumping it through carbon dioxide pipelines, it's putting it in oil fields to do something called enhanced oil recovery. So using that carbon to get more oil out of the ground. And then they say that carbon dioxide will be under the ground for, decades to come. It's not scientifically clear that will be the case. It's not scientifically clear that the carbon dioxide won't leak, just like methane has leaked through the fracking process. But I see CCUS is so important. I see it almost as the new frontier for the oil and gas industry. I see it as kind of the new fracking, the new way they're going to greenwash oil and gas for the next decades to come. So I think that that's something to look out for in a future Biden-Harris administration if they get elected.
And finally, the issue of Black Lives Matter and protests. Kamala Harris said that she does not believe that Breonna Taylor got justice. And I wanted to play what Mike Pence's response to that question was tonight on the debate stage.
The family of Breonna Taylor has our sympathies. But I trust our justice system, a grand jury that refused the evidence. And it really is remarkable that as a former prosecutor, you would assume that an impaneled grand jury looking at all the evidence got it wrong. But You're entitled to your opinion, Senator. I think, look, and with regard to George Floyd, there's no excuse for what happened to George Floyd, and justice will be served. But there's also no excuse for the rioting and looting that followed.
So we found someone that has faith in our criminal justice system. You know, Mike Pence wins that one. Maurice, what was your response to that?
Yeah, that I would describe that as low energy racism, right? I mean, so let's just pick that apart. His first statement was that he has sympathies for Breonna Taylor and his family, and then he says, but is a modifier that suggests that you're somehow pivoting away from that statement. And then he doubled down in his sort of blind faith in our justice system. You know, as a Black person who's been arrested and jailed for no reason, who's been beat up by police, yeah, I have a healthy fear of our justice system, as many Black people and many other people of color do. So the fact that he couldn't even articulate that and just double down in this fantasy that our justice system is just to be just supported writ large was really problematic. And then again, one of the things that he does, he juxtaposes justice for Black people with this law and order in the streets thing, right? And he later on talked about the fact that some property was destroyed in a protest. Again, putting on equal footing Black life and property, and somehow arguing that there is a debate between how much Black people's lives can be valued and whether or not we want quote unquote law and order. These are all dog whistles in order to inspire in his white nationalist base some sort of backlash. And it was pretty clear, like, again, very low energy Gentile racism.
And Steve, we'll give you the last word tonight.
Man, I don't know. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can beat Maurice on the low energy racism thing. But what I'll say is it's interesting how he did try to frame up Kamala Harris as someone who's a former prosecutor. I know that was one of her huge political liabilities during the primary season. That could even be described as a big reason why she didn't really resonate as well, because it is a time where there's so much grassroots, healthy skepticism towards people like district attorneys and attorney generals and police and the whole criminal justice system. And the way that he tried to frame it, I'm not 100% sure if she ever responded to it. I know that they were kind of talking past each other and all those things. I know he was trying to elicit a response from her. But yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting and insightful moment during the debate. And yeah, I just completely agree with pretty much everything else that Maurice said. So I don't have a whole lot more to add to it. It was well stated by him.
All right. Well, this was the vice presidential debate. Trump says he's ready to do the presidential debate in a week. We'll see what happens, but we will certainly, keep you updated on the Real News. We want to thank Steve and Maurice. Steve is our Real News climate correspondent, and Maurice Mitchell is with the Working Families Party. He's the national director. Thank you both for joining us.
Be here.
Good to be here. Good to do it again.
And thank you for everyone watching at therealnews.com.